The ongoing impeachment proceedings into President Trump were once again a main topic of discussion on the Sunday morning shows. Here's some of what you may have missed.
This is a crime in progress against the Constitution and against American democracy. We cannot take the risk that the next election will be corrupted through foreign interference solicited by the president, which he is clearly trying to do.
The question is, why are Republicans placing this president above their oath of office? I don't think any of us have any question that had Barack Obama engaged in the activity, the conduct, which is the subject of these articles of impeachment, every one of these Republicans would be voting to impeach him. And you know something? I have to hope to hell, George, if it were Barack Obama, I would vote to impeach him.
If he is ultimately exonerated in the Senate, if the Senate Republican majority refuses to discipline him through impeachment, he will be unbounded. And I am gravely concerned about what else he might do between now and the 2020 election when there are no restrictions on his behavior.
I would have liked to hear from Rudy Giuliani. I would have liked to hear from other folks, but it's the responsibility of the leaders of the House, Speaker Pelosi, to press for the third branch of government, the judicial branch, to compel action.
I'm asking you about McConnell saying he's taking his cues from the White House. Please answer the question.
So we weren't given a fair trial in the House at all. Now it goes to the Senate, and these senators, the president deserves to be heard. We should be working hand in hand with them. The rules of evidence will apply. These are the senators who will decide if our president is impeached, which will not happen. We should and will work hand in hand with them. These are some of the weakest charges out there, Chris. You know that.
But I think what's best for the country is to get this thing over with. I am clearly made up my mind. I'm not trying to hide the fact that I have disdain for the accusations in the process, so I don't need any witnesses. The president can make a request to call witnesses. They can make a request to call Mike Pence and Pompeo and Joe Biden and Hunter Biden. I am ready to vote on the underlying articles. I don't really need to hear a lot of witnesses.
Dan Balz is the chief correspondent covering national politics at the Washington Post, and he joins me now from Washington. Dan, thanks so much for being with us. Despite impeachment, there were a number of bipartisan deals reached this past week, from the USMCA trade agreement to a tentative federal spending deal. How are the parties framing their ability to work across the aisle during impeachment?
Well, for the president, I mean, this is a week in which he can look at the impeachment, or he can look at the victories that he got on some of these other matters and say to himself, I've got a lot I can talk about in a presidential campaign, seemingly confident that he's not going to be convicted in the Senate trial. So those all go into the basket of accomplishments that he will talk about between now and next November. And as we know, his ability to talk about these things in quite extravagant terms is pretty good. And so he will describe all of these as unbelievable victories, and it will stoke his support and try to draw over some of the people who may be on the fence about him. Democrats needed these as well because they've been under criticism that all of what they're doing is focused on impeachment, and there are many Democrats in some difficult swing districts in the House who are going to need these accomplishments to take back home to say, no, we are not just focused on impeachment, that we are doing serious business. We are working with the president when it is good for the country. We are opposing the president when we think it is necessary. So for both sides, having these things happen now, it may not be entirely coincidental, but both sides will look at it and say this is exactly what we need in addition to what's going on that's taking so much national attention with impeachment.
Right. At the same time, the conversation around impeachment remains completely polarized. Is this the new normal, Dan? Can we expect significant bipartisan work in the future?
Well, I would say probably not. I mean, I think that these are things that were moving down the track, that there was self-interest on both sides, for example, on the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade deal. On the spending matters, there's agreement that they've gotten on both sides. Both sides have made concessions. There are things that each side can tout as having been very good. But I think these are exceptions to the rule. We know that the country is deeply polarized. It's deeply polarized around this president. It's deeply polarized around impeachment. Those two go hand in hand, and I think that is likely to be the landscape that we have between now and November of 2020, and perhaps beyond, depending on the outcomes.
Well, what political risk does impeachment pose for both parties going into the November election?
Well, we've talked a lot over the last few weeks about the threat to the Democrats, or the risk to the Democrats, of doing something in which there is not significant bipartisan support. Speaker Pelosi had said earlier in the year that the only way to do impeachment is to have an ironclad case and to have bipartisan support, that if you do it in any other way, it risks tearing the country apart. And so they have proceeded without strong bipartisan support. As I said, the country is quite split over whether the president should be removed from office for the things that we've learned about during the Ukraine investigation. But for Republicans, there are also risks. There's a risk for the president, obviously, as he heads into re-election, and there's risk for some of the Republicans, particularly senators, who will be up for re-election in some difficult states, whether it's Colorado or Maine or some of the other places that we know where there are going to be competitive races. I think that we haven't seen the full effect of the impeachment issue on those races yet, but my guess is that we will see more of it once we get through the Senate trial.
Well, speaking of 2020, 7 Democratic candidates are threatening to boycott the next presidential primary debate in Los Angeles. It's supposed to take place on Thursday at Loyola Marymount University. Dan, tell us what's going on there, and will this issue get resolved in time?
Well, it's ironic because the debate was moved to Loyola Marymount because of labor issues at the prior venue. Now there are labor issues at the university. And a number of candidates, as you said, have indicated that they would not cross the picket lines if that labor dispute is still going on. I don't know the details right now of where those things stand. I have to believe that in the end they will resolve it and figure out a way to be able to hold this debate. But I think until we see a little bit more early in the week on how things are progressing, we can't say that for sure. I mean, the Democratic candidates clearly do not want to cross picket lines, even for a debate that could be very, very important, and certainly the last debate of this year. But I would guess in the end that they will get it resolved, and we will see a debate on Thursday night in California.
So in addition to that situation, 9 candidates signed a letter organized by New Jersey Senator Cory Booker urging the Democratic National Committee to change the rules that determine who actually qualifies to take part in these debates. How is this letter, Dan, going to play out with the party?
Well, I think we will know that when we get into next year and we begin to get a better sense of what the rules of the road will be for the debates ahead of the early state primaries and then from Super Tuesday forward. There obviously has been criticism of the DNC for the rules and the thresholds that they've put in place for these debates. There was also criticism of the DNC of such a big field, and couldn't they do something to begin to winnow the field? So, in a sense, they're in a difficult position no matter what they do. But there certainly is concern that there are viable candidates, or even if they're not particularly viable, candidates whose records and experience should put them on a debate stage in a serious Democratic nomination contest. We will see whether there is a way to resolve all of those kind of contradictions that have affected the early debates, but particularly now. I mean, there is an issue of the diversity of the debate stage, and earlier on we had a much more diverse debate stage than it looks like we're going to have going forward. And I think that's an issue that people of all stripes in the party are concerned about.
Finally, Dan, you recently wrote about former Vice President Joe Biden and his campaign's ability to sustain support despite facing more criticism than all of the other candidates. Why is his campaign proving to be so durable?
Well, a couple of reasons. One is that he has had the broadest support across the Democratic Party coalition of any of the candidates. He does well with virtually every group. I would say that the one group where he's weakest is younger voters. He does particularly well with African American voters, who, as we know, are very important in the nominating process. Vice President Biden is well liked, he is well respected, he is well known, and all of that, I think, has held up for him the kind of support that we've seen. Now, obviously, he's slipped in Iowa and New Hampshire. That's not insignificant, but even with those slippages, he's not yet slipped in South Carolina because of his strength in the African American support. So there's been a lot of talk this year about Biden's problems, his problems in the debates, some of the baggage that he brought into the election from his long Senate record, 4 decades in the Senate. And I think that to the extent that that has gotten much more attention than the fact that, you know, we come to the end of the year, he's still ahead in the national polls. I recognize that national polls at this stage are less important than what happens in the early states. But also, he's not out of it in Iowa or New Hampshire. And I talked to a Democratic strategist who's been involved in a lot of campaigns over the years. And I said to him, so what would happen if Vice President Biden won the Iowa caucuses? And he said he could actually run the table, which is to say he could get on a roll, get some momentum, and really be very, very difficult to stop. All of these are somewhat unknowns right now because we've got a month plus before we get to Iowa. We know that Iowa changes often dramatically in the last few weeks and sometimes in the final days. So nobody's putting anything in the bank. But I think the fact that he ends the year still, you know, not in perfect position, but certainly not in a terrible position, is one of the themes of 2019 that may have been overlooked.
All right, Dan Balz in Washington for us. Dan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Elaine.